Far in the north of Peru is a little visited region of the Amazonian Andes called Chachapoyas. Home to a pre-Incan society of the same name, it flourished here at the juncture of the Amazonian jungle and the Andean highlands for over 600 years. But its eventual fate was determined by a small upstart state from the south of Peru called the Incas. In the course of just 3 kings and less than 100 years, they became what was, for most of the 16th century, the largest empire in the world. For the Chachapoyas, 50 years of Inca rule meant the beginning of the end for their culture, as the Incas gradually relocated 1/3 of the population, and anyone thought likely to be rebellious was banished to the opposite end of the empire. It was at this time that the Spanish, including a penniless, illiterate 38-year-old adventurer named Francisco Pizarro, arrived in Panama. Over the next 21 years, he proved to be a capable soldier and natural leader, and eventually was given permission to explore southward. His first 2 expeditions were failures due to bad weather, lack of provisions, and native hostilities. But at the age of 60, he embarked on his 3rd voyage, which brought him finally to Peru. His duplicitous killing of the Inca king Atahualpa, and his ruthless assault on the Incan capital of Cusco. It was an audacious campaign, but remember, Pizarro couldn't have better timed his arrival. During the previous 10 years, 75% of the Incan population had died due to the combination of a bloody civil war between rival sons of the Inca, and more importantly, smallpox, brought to America by the Spanish, and which had made its way to Peru long before Pizarro. None of this was good for the people of Chachapoyas, but they thought they had found an ally to help them regain control of their lands. They fought valiantly alongside Pizarro to take Cusco and were promised their reward. Unfortunately, the Spanish became consumed with the legend of El Dorado, a golden city in the jungle, and the easiest access to the Amazon was via Chachapoyas. So the Spanish pressed huge numbers of them into being porters and guides, and they died by the tens of thousands. The result of these unrelenting blows was that over 90% of the population was killed or relocated. Today, a rich countryside, once home to hundreds of thousands enjoying a rich heritage 3 times the length of our own, lies forgotten and but sparsely inhabited. But enough historical context. Let's get on with the grand adventure. I'd come to Peru with my longtime ski buddies, primed for another epic bucket list trip. And as one said when accepting the invitation, hey, what could possibly go wrong? Chachapoyas lies in the north of Peru. It is bordered by 2 of Peru's biggest rivers, both of which flow to the Amazon. The journey began with a flight from the country's capital of Lima to the coastal town of Chiclayo. From there, it was a 10-hour drive across the Andes to the present-day town of Chachapoyas. Our next week was spent exploring but a small fraction of the possible Chachapoyan sites between here and the small town of Lemebamba. We then headed off on trek, hiking virtually cross-country before finally emerging at the village of Uchucmarca. Another 10-hour drive up and over the Andes, and we emerged at the fabulous colonial city of Cajamarca, from where we caught a flight back to Lima. Chachapoyas is actually an Incan word meaning cloud forest, and indeed the Chachapoyans made their home on the dividing line between the tropical rainforests leading down to the Amazon and the cloud-covered grasslands leading higher onto the eastern slopes of the Andes Mountains. It is a region often referred to as the Ceja de la Montaña, or eyebrow of the jungle, and from here the Chachapoyans controlled trade leading in both directions. Our first hike was to Gokta Falls, which in 2007 was written about in newspapers throughout the world. The story was that a young German explorer had just discovered them and determined its height to be 2,936 feet, which made it the 3rd highest waterfall in the world. Even the Peruvian press was all agog at this amazing discovery. The fact that even the Spanish conquistadors knew of it seemed to escape notice. Then there's a small matter of about 100 yards separating the upper falls and the lower falls, which throws in the question whether it's one falls or two. But undoubtedly I'm being a little bit cynical. The truth is the falls were beautiful, and Chachapoyas has a great number of other impressive ones as well. During these first days, we were based out of two small hotels, one in Chachapoyas and the second in the town of Lemebamba. The Shalka in Chachapoyas had undeserved pretensions of being a high-end boutique establishment, but both of the hotels were clean, friendly, and certainly more than adequate for this motley group of disreputable old farts.
From the green coffee thing?
Yeah. So how do we do this?
You just kind of keep it there like tobacco?
So you have a bunch, and then you put a bit of it.
Each day we hiked into the surrounding countryside, sometimes meeting villagers and school kids en route. These kids were particularly cute. The goal of each of our day's hikes was to climb up to one of the many fortified ridgetop towns built by the Chachapoyas. The most famous is without doubt that of Cuelap. Here the Chachapoyans flattened an entire ridgetop and an area encompassing more than 15 acres. They built a series of defensive walls, some as high as 60 feet, and on the flattened upper surface, resembling an enormous aircraft carrier, we could clearly see the foundations of hundreds of circular walled homes, sufficient, they say, to house a population of 5,000 people. Normally nearby each of these Chachapoyan towns, they would build elaborate cliff mausoleums like these at a site called Revache. From these promontories, the mummified remains of their ancestors oversaw the community and were regularly visited. By the way, DNA tests have conclusively proven that the supposedly light-skinned Chachapoyans were not wayward Vikings or Phoenicians. There is no end to the number of archaeological sites one can hike to here. On the map, each yellow square represents a known Chachapoyan settlement, but experts theorize that many, many more have yet to be found, since most are covered in dense jungle vegetation. For us, it was a huge treat, as it meant that we had several of the ruins completely to ourselves, and one couldn't help but daydream of Indiana Jones as we worked our way along a series of ridges from one ruin to the next, and the zing of our local guide's machete sang out as he cleared a small path for us.
The jungle part of the trek.
What do you think of this trail?
Living the life.
And round, and then goes on. And there's this one, which comes round, and then goes on to the bigger into
Well, obviously we all came down here searching for our own inner selves. Some go deeper into the jungle for the true taste of the country. The coca leaves, they don't taste so good, I gotta be honest with you. I don't think it's gonna be a big seller in the US, so scratch that one off the list.
I'm here to see these classic stone houses of Chachapoyas that have not been excavated. There's nobody here, and have this magic place all to herself. I just wish that the covered with orchids. I wish they were in bloom. That would really be really be something to see. But it's magic. It's magic being here without just our group.
The second half of our trip was to be a trek. Hiking directly out from the door of our hotel in Lemebamba, we headed south up the narrow Atuen Valley. This first day turned out to be a mellow beginning as we followed along a newly constructed dirt road. But the supposition was that this would soon end and that the trails ahead would be primitive at best. And soon enough we arrived at the juncture of a side valley. As we turned up it, our nice road turned into a muddy trail, and it looked clear that our adventure was about to begin. Late that first afternoon at a spot called Tajopampa, a wide, flat meadow which lay directly in front of an impressive cliff face called La Petaca. At first, we were principally consumed with the excitement of reaching our first camp and learning that fully 6 of us would have our own private tents. But we were soon made aware of how special these cliffs were. While we could barely see them with the naked eye, Rob had brought along a spotting scope, and it quickly became apparent that the cliffs were festooned with elaborate burial platforms, many of which had their precious mummy bundles still intact. Some of the structures are porticos to large caves or chulpas, and archaeologists that have explored some of the 120 that dot the cliff say many contain dozens of lovingly placed burials. That next morning, we awoke to a solid coating of frost. Although we wouldn't be in sight of snow peaks, there was no doubt we were still in the mountains. And if it happened to rain, as advertised was a possibility, we were likely to experience some cold moments. Hiking up onto a nearby ridge, we were able to get better views than we had the prior evening. The Chachapoyans practice ancestor worship, so even though these funerary chambers and caves looked inaccessible to us, they were actually visited regularly. I suspect a few of the burials must have been sacrificial offerings. This drawing on inspection seems to be of someone holding a head, while blood spurts from the headless corpse to the right. We really had no idea what kind of terrain we were headed into, but it quickly became apparent that although we were for the most part above the tree line, the countryside was going to be impressively green. The narrow canyon soon opened up as we gained elevation into a seemingly never-ending series of stunningly gorgeous valleys. And despite passing the ruins of multiple Chachapoyan settlements, today it largely is uninhabited, except for an occasional valley with a small farm, usually run by an elderly couple, and growing but a tiny plot of corn and grazing either a dozen cows or horses. It made for delightful hiking, and I began daydreaming of taking on the entire length of the Inca's royal highway that leads from Ecuador to Cusco, something which is now probably possible, but which for most of my life was not because of politics and banditry. I must admit to loving the day-to-day rhythm of camping, especially when you're on an organized trek and all the cooking and cleaning is taken care of for you.
It's about 12:30 p.m. We've been walking for about 4 hours. We've seen a very nice little hacienda complex of an elderly couple who gave us some vegetables and potatoes. And we've seen lots of ruins today. The weather, as you can tell, is spectacular. We're very lucky that we're not in fog and rain. And the company is even better. So we're having a wonderful trek through the central part of Peru. And it's wonderful.
In promoting the adventure, I had warned that the trip could go in two directions. If the weather was bad, as is normally the case here, it would be a slippery mud fest. And if it was good, it would be a bit of a walk in the park. Well, as you will have noted, the weather to this point had been excellent. And so we made our way past a small village with some Incan baths still in place, and after stopping to say hi and see if there was anything interesting for sale at their once-a-week mobile market, we continued up the valley and eventually crossed over our first big pass, 13,500-foot Ulila Pass, which after the easy hiking to date meant there were some tired puppies by the time we made it to the top. Then it was downhill to camp and what had become a delightful afternoon ritual of bathing by a stream. Each day we were either given a box lunch in the morning, or on other days they prepared a luxurious picnic, which we often followed by a quick nap. Somewhere around day 5 of the trek, we awoke to a particularly cold and windy morning. While it was likely still a day away, we could feel that the weather, she was a-changing.
I read the one with the kid that the father and the son crossed the road, yeah. That was good.
¿Qué te importa que te ame si tú no me quieres ya? El amor que ya ha pasado no se debe recordar. Fui la ilusión de tu vida, un día lejano ya. Hoy represento el pasado, no me puedo conformar. Hoy represento el pasado, no me puedo conformar. Si las cosas que uno...
As you can see, these were not the snow-capped crags of the Cordillera Blanca or the Annapurnas, but the succession of big, impressive, ponderosa-like valleys just kept coming, and we all had adapted to its unique rhythm and undeniable charm. The ostensible goal of our trek was to reach Guayabamba Lake, sacred to the Chachapoyas because of its perfect roundness, and it probably didn't hurt that the cliffs that tightly ring its western flanks are perfect for burials. We had meant to use this day to climb up to the ruins of Vera Vera, which overlooked the lake and was thought to have been a Chachapoyan pilgrimage site. It's a rainy day. These guys are reduced to playing cribbage of all things.
You don't put them down. You discard one.
Give me five cards, and you put one in your own crib.
One and 2 5. 400. 400 throwing one. Bust.
1.
20.
Down 5.
We're hoping. 30.
Go.
4 fours. 4 fours. That's 800. 900.
Is it all for naught? Comes down to 1. Oh.
Well, we certainly were getting a sense of what Chachapoyas is often like. It rained steadily throughout the entire day and well into the night.
I know where you're going on a day like today.
That next morning we woke to delightful sun. The clouds were now below us, covering the Amazon basin like a blanket. The rain had had the good manners to come on our scheduled rest day, so it hadn't been that big of a hardship to have been tent-bound. However, now that we were underway once again, it was obvious that the rains had made a mess of our primitive trails. Today was going to be a much longer day than we ever expected. The original plan had been to use our rest day to climb a ridge which protruded into the Guayabamba Valley, and on top of which the Chachapoyas had built the settlement of Vera Vera. From its perch overlooking Lake Guayabamba, it was supposedly one of their most sacred centers. Today it is completely overgrown, but a few decades ago, Vince Lee, one of the archaeologists who has worked several times with Wilderness Travel, did some delightful drawings of the site, and a visit had been on my bucket list ever since I first saw these drawings. Unfortunately, our time to explore Vera Vera was much too short, as we were shoehorning it in at the beginning of our final day's hike. It ended up making for a very long day of hiking, but nonetheless it was quite enjoyable as we passed a large alpine lake and slowly descended through impressive valleys towards the small town of Uchucmarca. That next morning, after a final night camped on their soccer pitch, we had a quick opportunity to repack our gear and take a last group photo before taking off on our final drive. It was an amazing one-lane road down to the Marañón River. Thank God we encountered no other vehicles the entire ride. From there, it was up almost 6,000 feet as we continued on to the city of Cajamarca. We spent 2 nights here at a delightful hot springs resort, and in every sense it felt like our trip had come full circle. We began with the tale of the Spanish killing Atahualpa in Cajamarca, and now here we were luxuriating in the same hot springs Atahualpa had camped by right before being captured. Quite a trip, but it seems that adventures like this lie around every corner in Peru.